More on the impact of trade negotiations and the future of NAFTA, I'm joined by Philip Oxhorn, political science professor at McGill University in Montreal and founding director for the Institute for the Study of International Development. Welcome to the show.
A pleasure to be here.
So, given what's happening, where do things stand right now with the NAFTA negotiations, if we can indeed still call them that?
Well, the U.S. has to at least try and get Canada on board because its authorization from the legislature for negotiating or renegotiating NAFTA depends upon all three countries, Mexico, the U.S., and Canada being involved. So there's a lot of pressure on the U.S. to make sure that they get Canada on board and avoid other problems. The idea that they have 90 days before they need to, in order for the current president of Mexico to be able to sign before he steps down is generally true, but most people think that there's still a little bit of wiggle room so that the negotiations could continue for a few days next week and they would still make that deadline. Mexico needs this agreement because both the incumbent president, who's leaving office in December, and the president-elect, who will assume power after that, want this deal settled so that it's not hanging over Mexico's political future.
And as you mentioned, that 90-day window that they have comes right up against when Mexico's new president comes into office on December 1st. And as we know, Andrés Manuel López Obrador does have his own issues with Trump, but he does support renegotiating NAFTA. Could all this be undone when he comes into office?
No, it's very unlikely that it would be undone. He's had his say in the final negotiations before Mexico signed on. And López Obrador wants this a closed chapter before he assumes power because he has other priorities. So there likely will be some changes, perhaps in the energy sector, but there's no way that López Obrador wants to open up a can of worms by returning to the issue of NAFTA.
Now, if we do still get stuck at this sticking point with Canada, and it does end up being instead these multiple bilateral deals, just how different would the trade relationship for all three countries be if they did in fact become bilateral deals?
Well, this is what nobody knows, and the reason they don't know it is because whether it's bilateral or trilateral, it just isn't clear what concessions Canada was willing to make. So having Canada out of it is the only thing that would be certain. Whether there'll be a bilateral agreement, hard to say. Honestly, I don't think there's more likelihood that Canada would enter into a bilateral agreement than the trilateral agreement. Everything that the Trump administration has done has made it clear that they're not going to make concessions to Canada, or at least not very big concessions, period, with bilateral or multilateral.
Now, as we know, we already have the U.S.-China trade war going on. So how is uncertainty with NAFTA, on top of that, affecting the sectors that are linked to these deals?
Well, this is the big question, really. It's all intertwined, and no one really has been able to disentangle everything. With supply chains, various tariffs being imposed unilaterally by Trump, being matched by other countries, whether it's China or Canada. This is really very uncertain times. Also, the Trump administration and others are calling for reforms of the World Trade Organization. In many ways, it's a vacuum that's lacking a leadership, I think. And what we're seeing that with NAFTA in kind of like a microcosm, Mexico, U.S., Canada. It's kind of a bunch of unknowns, and no one is really certain where and when it's going to end. The hope is it will end soon because economic instability doesn't help anybody, including the Trump administration.
Now, in a recent statement, Robert Lighthizer, the U.S. trade representative, said that the president notified Congress of his intent to sign a trade agreement with Mexico and Canada, if it's willing, 90 days from now. But the negotiations with Canada are still ongoing. So for people who are trying to wrap their heads around all these deadlines, what can we expect to happen between now and then?
Well, next week is going to be critical because then we'll see exactly how far apart Canada and the U.S. are. The Congress is going to have to react to Trump's declaration that he's reached an agreement with Mexico and wants to pursue that, which again goes against the authorizing legislation that allowed him to renegotiate NAFTA. So key decisions are going to be made over the course of the next week or so, simply because the clock is running down and there's no reason to spread out, to stretch out the inevitable, which is, can Canada join? Will the concessions the U.S. be willing to make sufficient enough? Are the concessions that Canada might consider sufficient enough? What will Congress do either way?
And of course, hanging over this are President Trump's statements about not giving concessions to Canada. Do you think this is actually going to dampen any hopes of reaching a deal?
Oh, of course it is. I mean, since the G7 meeting over the summer when Trump left in a huff and quite publicly insulted Prime Minister Trudeau, Canada's relationship with the U.S. has been very tense, to say the least. And so the last thing that the Trudeau government can afford to do is look like it's kowtowing to U.S. pressure, because this is something that Trump, deliberately or not, set up for himself. It's very difficult for Canada not to insist on at least what appear to be significant concessions from the U.S. Otherwise, it will look weak. Trudeau will look like he's caved in to Trump demands that many Canadians do not think are legitimate or fair. And in the end, it's not at all clear that even if there is a three-way agreement between Mexico, the U.S., and Canada, that the resulting new NAFTA will be that much better, and maybe it will be worse. We know car prices are going to go up for sure, and that's not a good thing.
All right, thank you so much for your insights. Professor Philip Oxhorn of McGill University and founding director at the Institute for the Study of International Development.